The convoy moved through central Tehran at exactly 9:38 in the morning. 3 black SUVs, no markings, no police escort visible to the naked eye, just 3 vehicles weaving through the ordinary Saturday traffic of a city that had no idea what was about to happen. Inside the middle vehicle, behind layers of armored plating and tinted glass, sat the most protected man in the Islamic Republic. A man who had spent 37 years making himself impossible to find, impossible to reach, and impossible to kill. Above the city, invisible to anyone on the ground, the intelligence was already flowing. Satellites tracked the convoy's movement to the millisecond. Analysts in Langley cross-referenced the vehicle signatures against months of pattern data. In a secure facility outside Tel Aviv, targeting coordinates were being finalized. The operation had been years in the making, but now, in the space of a single Saturday morning, it would either succeed or fail, and the entire Middle East would tilt on whatever happened next. His name was Ali Khamenei, Supreme Leader of Iran, the man who disappeared underground. For nearly 4 decades, he had ruled the Islamic Republic from behind walls no outsider had ever breached, walls of concrete, walls of bureaucracy, walls of men who would die before revealing where he slept. He had survived assassination attempts, popular uprisings, international sanctions, and the relentless attention of the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies. He had built a fortress that no one could see, inside a city he controlled absolutely. And on the morning of February 28th, 2026, that fortress crumbled. Before we get into exactly how it happened, how the CIA and Mossad spent years closing in on the world's most elusive leader, and what unfolded in those final minutes above a Tehran compound, I want to take a second to tell you about this channel. Every single day, we bring you real spy stories. Not Hollywood dramatizations, not sanitized history, actual operations, genuine tradecraft, and the true human cost behind the intelligence wars that shape our world. If that's the kind of content you're after, hit the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations in modern history, and this is just the beginning of what we cover here. Oh, and real quick, drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from, whether it's New York or Nairobi, London or Lagos, Tehran or Tokyo. I genuinely love knowing who's tuning in from where. Tell me your city and country down in the comments right now. All right, back to the man who disappeared underground. Ali Khamenei was born in 1939 in Mossad, a city in northeastern Iran known for its Shia shrines and its deeply conservative clerical culture. His father was a cleric of modest means, and from an early age, the young Khamenei absorbed both the religious traditions of that world and the political radicalism that was beginning to sweep through it. By the time he was in his 20s, he had already aligned himself with Ruhollah Khomeini, the firebrand cleric whose opposition to the Shah's Western-backed monarchy was getting people killed. The Shah's intelligence service, SAVAK, arrested Khamenei at least 6 times over the years. Those arrests left marks. During one period of imprisonment, he reportedly developed severe nerve damage in his right arm, an injury that would remain visible in his public appearances for the rest of his life. But the arrests didn't break him. If anything, they hardened him. He emerged from each stint in custody more committed to the revolutionary cause, more convinced that the Shah's regime had to fall and that a new Islamic order had to replace it. When the 1979 revolution finally came, Khamenei was ready. He became a member of the Revolutionary Council, the inner circle that governed Iran in the chaotic months after the Shah fled. He survived a 1981 assassination attempt. A bomb hidden in a tape recorder detonated near him during a speech, killing several people around him and leaving him with permanent injuries. He served 2 terms as Iran's president from 1981 to 1989, accumulating influence and loyalty inside the revolutionary system, even as he lacked the highest religious credentials traditionally expected of senior clerics. When Khomeini died in 1989, the question of succession should have been straightforward. It wasn't. Khamenei was not considered a top-tier religious authority, a significant problem in a system where the supreme leader was supposed to be a grand ayatollah. But constitutional amendments were quietly pushed through. The religious qualification requirements were lowered. The system was reshaped to fit the man. Several senior clerics objected, but their objections were absorbed and then ignored. Khamenei became supreme leader, and within a decade anyone who had questioned his elevation had been marginalized, imprisoned, or rendered politically irrelevant. Over the next 3 decades, he built something extraordinary. He didn't just govern Iran, he engineered a state apparatus that made his own removal structurally impossible. The clerical body responsible for checking his power was packed with loyalists. The judiciary answered to him. The military answered to him. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which began as a revolutionary militia of ideologically committed fighters, evolved under his guidance into one of the most powerful institutions in the Middle East. A political, economic, and military force that controlled construction contracts, telecommunications infrastructure, oil logistics, and an expanding network of foreign operations. That foreign network was what made Khamenei genuinely dangerous beyond Iran's borders. He cultivated what his regime called the axis of resistance, a constellation of allied militias and proxy forces that stretched from Beirut to Baghdad to Sana'a, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthi forces in Yemen. Each group received Iranian financing, weapons, training, and strategic direction, all coordinated through the IRGC's Quds Force, the foreign operations wing that Khamenei had deliberately expanded and empowered over decades. He also oversaw Iran's nuclear program. Publicly, he issued a religious edict, a fatwa, declaring nuclear weapons forbidden under Islamic law. Privately, under his authority, Iranian engineers enriched uranium to levels that brought Tehran closer and closer to weapons-grade capability. Western intelligence agencies watched the enrichment levels rise. Diplomatic pressure, sanctions regimes, and the 2015 nuclear agreement temporarily slowed the program. But after the United States withdrew from that agreement in 2018 under President Trump, the program accelerated again, and Khamenei framed every Western objection as colonial bullying and foreign interference in Iranian sovereignty. Through waves of internal unrest, the 2009 Green Movement, the 2019 fuel price protests, the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising, Khamenei's response was always the same: crackdown, arrest, disappear the leaders, deploy the IRGC. The 2009 protests had been the most politically threatening of his tenure. Millions of Iranians filling the streets to challenge an election result that most independent observers considered fraudulent, chanting slogans that directly challenged his legitimacy. The security crackdown that followed lasted months, involved mass arrests, torture, and executions, and effectively destroyed the organized reformist movement inside Iran for nearly a decade. The 2022 uprising, triggered by the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody, was different in character, broader geographically, more decentralized organizationally, and more focused on fundamental questions about women's freedom and the legitimacy of clerical rule itself. Khamenei's response was the same in its brutality and more sophisticated in its execution. Iran's security apparatus under his direction became increasingly refined in its digital repression, using facial recognition systems, social media monitoring, and, according to multiple intelligence reports, Chinese surveillance AI to track protest organizers in real time. The man who disappeared underground had, in plain sight, built a system designed to last forever. Then, June 2025 arrived, and everything changed. The 12-day war between Israel and Iran in June 2025 began with a level of violence that shocked even veteran analysts. U.S. B-2 stealth bombers struck Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordo and Natanz, sites that had been hardened specifically against aerial attack, buried inside mountains, and reinforced with meters of concrete. The strikes were devastating to Iran's nuclear infrastructure. They were also deeply personal to Khamenei. The facilities he had spent decades building and defending had been reached and destroyed by enemies he had publicly sworn would never penetrate Iranian territory. When the 12 days ended and a fragile ceasefire took hold, Khamenei's behavior changed completely. He canceled public appearances. He withdrew from routine meetings. Senior officials who had previously enjoyed regular access to him found themselves suddenly rerouted through intermediaries. The supreme leader of Iran, the man who had always maintained at least a ceremonial public presence, essentially vanished. He retreated into a network of fortified underground facilities that Iran had been constructing and expanding for years. Intelligence assessments described his primary shelter as a deeply buried bunker complex in Tehran's Lavizan district. The estimates put it somewhere between 90 and 100 meters underground, deeper than most subway systems, deeper even than some of Iran's fortified nuclear sites. The complex was reportedly interconnected with tunnel networks that extended beneath significant portions of the city, allowing movement between locations without surfacing. The security protocols around him became almost theatrically extreme. Senior officials summoned to meet the supreme leader were transported in blacked-out vehicles and blindfolded before entering underground passageways. The blindfolding wasn't symbolic. It was functional, ensuring that even top figures in the regime could not identify the precise location of the bunker entrances. IRGC commanders confirmed this practice applied to national security officials at the highest levels of the Iranian government. His sons, most notably Mojtaba Khamenei, became the primary intermediaries between the supreme leader and the outside world. Mojtaba managed coordination with key figures in the IRGC and clerical establishment, creating an additional human buffer layer that insulated his father from any potential exposure. In early February 2026, satellite imagery analysts noted something significant. Several known underground entrances in Tehran and Isfahan appeared to have been concealed or sealed. Iran was attempting to complicate targeting efforts by eliminating the visible signatures of his movement network. The man who disappeared underground had gone deeper. He believed he was unreachable. He was wrong. The Central Intelligence Agency had been working on Khamenei for years, but the intensity of the surveillance effort escalated dramatically after the June 2025 conflict. The challenge was not simply finding him. It was finding him at a moment when striking him was operationally possible. The distinction mattered enormously, because locating a bunker 100 meters underground and successfully targeting a person inside that bunker are two entirely different problems. CIA analysts approached the problem through a methodology known as pattern of life analysis. The concept is straightforward in theory and enormously complex in execution. Every person, no matter how security conscious, creates patterns, routines, rhythms, the time of day when certain vehicles move, the energy consumption spikes in specific districts when underground HVAC systems activate, the rotation schedules of security personnel around certain facilities. None of these individual data points reveal a location, but aggregated over months, cross-referenced against dozens of other data streams, they begin to build a picture. The CIA's analytical teams reportedly used AI-driven tracking systems to process this data at a scale no human analyst could manage alone. Vehicle movements across Tehran were tracked using a combination of satellite imagery and, critically, compromised civilian infrastructure. Traffic monitoring cameras throughout the city had been quietly accessed, hacked in the operational vocabulary of intelligence work, and their feeds were being routed to analysts who could track convoy patterns across the urban grid. Urban infrastructure, as it turned out, was far more revealing than anyone in Tehran had anticipated. Parking sensors registered vehicle weights and movement patterns. Cell tower pings created invisible maps of personnel locations. Elevator power usage in buildings connected to underground facilities created detectable signatures during periods of occupancy. Even the airflow systems of deep bunkers, the ventilation shafts that allowed people to breathe underground, created thermal signatures detectable from above. The analysts working this target operated under a framework that counterintelligence professionals call pattern of life mapping. The premise is that no human being, regardless of training, discipline, or awareness of surveillance, can operate without creating patterns, physical patterns, behavioral patterns, energy patterns, even the patterns of apparent randomness, when randomized deliberately, carry their own signatures that trained analysts can detect. A leader who moves unpredictably still needs to move. A bunker that is intentionally sealed still requires power. A security convoy that takes a different route every day still has to depart from somewhere and arrive somewhere. The CIA's analytical teams were not trying to find Khamenei in real time. That was the crucial conceptual distinction between the old approach and the new one. They were building a model, a probabilistic AI-refined model of his behavioral signature, that would allow them to recognize when the right intelligence window opened, whether the confirmation they were receiving was consistent with that model. When a source reported that Khamenei would attend a specific meeting at a specific location, the question the analyst could answer was not simply, "Do we believe this source?" It was, "Does this report align with 6 months of pattern data suggesting that this location, at this time of day, on this type of occasion, represents a credible behavioral choice for this subject?" That combination of human intelligence and algorithmic pattern confirmation was what gave the final intelligence picture its unusual confidence level. No single data point was definitive. All of them together were. Mossad had been running its own parallel intelligence campaign, informed by decades of operational experience inside Iran. The 2018 seizure of Iran's nuclear archive had been a watershed moment for Israeli intelligence. A Mossad team operating inside Tehran had located, accessed, and extracted over 100,000 documents and files relating to Iran's nuclear weapons program, the so-called Atomic Archive, from a warehouse in a Tehran suburb. The operation demonstrated something that Iranian security officials had assumed was impossible, that Mossad could reach inside the heart of the Islamic Republic and take what it wanted. The archive operation had revealed something beyond its specific intelligence value. It had demonstrated conclusively that Iran's internal counterintelligence posture had critical gaps. The warehouse in Shorabad had been protected, but not protected against a determined team with precise pre-operational surveillance. The guards followed predictable patterns. The physical security relied on the assumption of obscurity rather than active defense. And the human beings involved in managing the facility had behaviors, vehicle movements, communication patterns, routine logistics that could be mapped, predicted, and exploited. Those same vulnerabilities, Mossad analysts concluded, almost certainly existed throughout the Iranian security apparatus. The blindfolding of generals was a symptom of a system that understood information was its primary vulnerability. But information doesn't flow in only one direction. Every person who was blindfolded still had to be transported from somewhere. Every intermediary who carried messages between Khamenei and the outside world had a phone that pinged cell towers. Every supply chain that kept the bunker operational, food, medicine, technical equipment, staff rotations, left traces in Tehran's urban infrastructure. In the years following the archive operation, Mossad refined its capabilities against Iranian targets. Targeted eliminations of senior Hezbollah figures, the assassination of Hamas leadership, operations that worked their way progressively deeper into the command structures of Iran's proxy network. Each operation generated intelligence for the next. Each successful strike on an underground command facility taught Israeli operators something about the structural vulnerabilities of buried hardened targets. The September 2024 elimination of Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's longtime leader, who had himself spent years living underground in Beirut, was the most significant proof of concept. Nasrallah had operated from a bunker beneath a Beirut suburb, surrounded by layers of security and supported by a community that was deeply hostile to any Israeli presence. Mossad penetrated the facility anyway. The operation demonstrated that underground command bunkers, regardless of their depth or their security protocols, were vulnerable to the combination of precise intelligence and the right munitions. Nasrallah had been underground for years. He moved rarely. He communicated through intermediaries. He understood, as Khamenei understood, that the primary threat to his survival was information. If the enemy knew exactly where he was, no amount of concrete could save him. The solution was to ensure the enemy never knew exactly where he was. The problem, in both cases, was the same. A leader who cannot be reached cannot lead. Nasrallah still needed to communicate with his commanders. He still needed to hold meetings that mattered. He still needed, on certain occasions, to be in a specific place at a specific time for reasons that could not be delegated to intermediaries. Those moments, rare, carefully managed, never publicized, were the moments Mossad learned to hunt. The Israeli operation against Nasrallah had used multiple converging intelligence streams: thermal mapping of underground airflow shafts, penetration of communication frequencies used by Hezbollah's inner security detail, and human-level assets who had been positioned over years specifically to confirm high-value target locations. None of these methods alone would have been sufficient. Together, they created an intelligence picture reliable enough to justify the strike. The lesson Israeli planners drew was explicit. Thermal detection of underground airflow shafts, combined with pattern-of-life analysis of surface movements and cyber intrusion into local infrastructure, could map a bunker complex from the outside without ever entering it. Once the map was accurate enough, the right penetrating munition would do the rest. Sleeper assets, intelligence sources embedded in Tehran's urban fabric over years or decades, were reportedly reactivated during this period, providing human-level confirmation of information that satellite and signals intelligence could only approximate. The combination of human, SIGINT, cyber intelligence, and AI-driven pattern analysis was building toward something. But the operation still lacked its final element. It needed a moment, a specific, confirmable, time-bound window when Khamenei would be in a known location. That window required luck, patience, and one more critical piece of the puzzle. Here is something that almost no one discussed at the time of the June 2025 strikes. In the days immediately following the U.S. bombing of Iran's nuclear sites, then-President Trump made a statement that seemed, at the time, like typical presidential bravado. He publicly claimed that the United States had known Khamenei's precise location during the strikes and had chosen not to target him. He framed this as a deliberate decision, a preserved option, a form of strategic leverage, a signal that the United States was showing restraint but retained the capability to escalate. Intelligence analysts who heard the statement understood its real significance. Trump had just told the world that American intelligence had Khamenei located. But the more important implication, the one that mattered operationally, was what the decision not to strike actually enabled. Every additional month that Khamenei lived gave CIA and Mossad more time to refine the surveillance network, more pattern data, more confirmed infrastructure, more opportunity to identify the specific conditions under which a strike could succeed. The decision not to kill him in June 2025 was, in retrospect, the decision that made killing him in February 2026 possible. By the late fall of 2025, intelligence indicated that Khamenei had slightly relaxed his security protocols. Not dramatically. The blindfolding continued. The intermediary layers remained. The bunker remained his primary residence. But analysts detected subtle shifts in the pattern data. Certain coordination meetings that had been conducted entirely through intermediaries were occasionally being held in person. Senior IRGC commanders were meeting with him directly in limited circumstances. The extreme isolation of the immediate post-war period had begun, slowly, to normalize. In early February 2026, a piece of intelligence arrived that shifted the entire operation into a different phase. A source, the specific nature of the intelligence has not been publicly confirmed, indicated that a high-level leadership meeting was being organized for the morning of Saturday, February 28th. The meeting would take place at a compound in central Tehran that housed offices of the Supreme Leader, the Presidency, and the Supreme National Security Council. Multiple senior figures from the IRGC and the national security apparatus were confirmed as attendees, and Khamenei himself would be there. CIA analysts ran the assessment through their confirmation protocols. Pattern data was cross-referenced against the new human intelligence. Vehicle movement signatures from the previous weeks were analyzed against expected convoy patterns for the identified compound. Energy consumption data for the underground facilities beneath the compound was analyzed for consistency with preparation for a high-level meeting. The assessment came back with a confidence level that analysts described as high, unusually high, given the difficulty of tracking the Supreme Leader's movements under normal circumstances. The intelligence window was real, but it presented an immediate operational dilemma that almost derailed the entire operation. Standard military doctrine for strikes against heavily defended high-value targets in urban environments strongly favored nighttime execution. Night strikes degraded the effectiveness of visual targeting by Iranian air defense operators. They complicated the response of ground-based security forces. They reduced the likelihood of civilian casualties by limiting the number of people present in and around target structures. Every major precision strike operation in recent memory had been executed at night for these reasons. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning, daylight, 9 o'clock. The intelligence window would be open for hours, then close permanently. Decision-makers in Washington and Jerusalem faced the choice directly: strike at night and miss the meeting, potentially the only window they would ever have with this level of confirmation, or override decades of operational doctrine, conduct a daylight strike against a hardened compound in the center of one of the most densely defended cities in the Middle East, and accept all the complications that entailed. The decision was made to strike in daylight. I want to stop here for a moment because what we're talking about is a decision that goes far beyond military tactics. The deliberate targeting of a head of state, a sitting leader of a sovereign nation, on his own soil, in the middle of a capital city, is one of the most consequential choices any government can authorize. Every international law framework, every established norm of state conduct, every precedent from modern warfare runs directly into the reality of what the United States and Israel were preparing to do. Was it justified? Was removing Khamenei, the architect of decades of regional violence, of proxy wars that killed hundreds of thousands, of a nuclear program that threatened the entire region, a legitimate act of targeted military action against an enemy combatant? Or was it an assassination of a head of state that set a precedent that every government on earth should fear? Drop your answer in the comments below. This is one of the genuine moral debates of our time, and I want to know where you stand on it, because what happened next left no room for ambiguity. The operational plan for what would be called Operation Epic Fury was built around a fundamental problem. Khamenei's compound sat in central Tehran, protected by Iran's integrated air defense network, one of the most layered and sophisticated in the region, significantly upgraded since the June 2025 conflict. Iranian radar systems, surface-to-air missile batteries, and interceptor aircraft were all on heightened alert following the previous war. Any strike package attempting to reach central Tehran would face active air defense response within minutes of being detected. The solution was not to fight through those defenses. It was to blind them. Phase 1 of the operation involved U.S. military assets launching a coordinated suppression campaign against Iran's integrated air defense network. Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from naval platforms in the Gulf targeted radar installations and command and control nodes. HIMARS long-range rocket systems struck additional air defense infrastructure from ground positions. And in what analysts described as the first large-scale combat deployment of one-way attack drones at this operational scale, dozens of low-cost expendable drones were launched simultaneously across multiple trajectories. The drone swarm served two purposes. It saturated Iranian radar operators with targets, forcing them to prioritize and deprioritize under extreme time pressure, and it physically destroyed radar arrays and communication nodes that cruise missiles alone might have missed. Within the first 15 to 20 minutes of the operation, Iran's integrated air defense picture over central Tehran had been severely degraded. Not eliminated, but degraded enough to create what planners called a temporary operational corridor. Into that corridor flew the Israeli strike package. Israeli aircraft conducting long-range penetration operations into Iranian airspace had done it before, notably during strikes on Iranian weapons shipments in Syria over years of covert operations, and during the June 2025 war. But this was different in scale and target. The aircraft carried deep penetration munitions, bunker buster warheads designed to continue driving through reinforced concrete after initial impact, detonating at depth rather than on the surface. The strike package was deliberately small, precision over volume. Multiple buildings inside the compound complex were designated as simultaneous targets. The timing from initial U.S. asset launch to Israeli munitions impact on the compound was reported as approximately 2 hours and 5 minutes. At 9:40 in the morning Tehran time on February 28, 2026, the munitions arrived. Multiple structures inside the compound were struck within seconds of each other. The building where senior military and political officials had gathered for the meeting was hit by several precision rounds in rapid succession. Adjacent structures, potential command nodes, emergency communication facilities, alternate shelter entrances were targeted simultaneously to prevent any immediate relocation. Khamenei was underground at the time of impact. That much was confirmed by subsequent reporting. The bunker beneath the compound had absorbed him, as it always did. But here is where the intelligence proved decisive in a way that his entire security apparatus had failed to account for. The bunker beneath the central compound was not the deepest facility in his network. It was not the 90 to 100 meter reinforced chamber in the Lavizan district that had been hardened specifically against the heaviest available munitions. The compound bunker was a working facility, functional, protected, but not built to withstand deep penetrating warheads. Why was he there and not in the deeper facility? Analysts have offered several explanations, and none of them are mutually exclusive. The meeting was daytime, which may have created a sense of operational normalcy, a belief that the vulnerability window for a strike was lower during daylight hours. The decision to override standard nighttime doctrine had been held so tightly within Washington and Jerusalem that it may never have leaked into Iranian counterintelligence channels. And there is a third, simpler explanation. 37 years of surviving had perhaps created, at some level, the conviction that the routines that had kept him alive this long would continue to do so. In the end, ventilation shafts and reinforced concrete ceilings have limits. The penetrating munitions reached him. Iranian state media's initial response was denial. Official communications dismissed the reports as enemy propaganda. State television broadcast ordinary programming. Social media inside Iran was flooded with conflicting claims, government-sponsored counter-narratives, and fragments of eyewitness accounts from people near the compound who described explosions of unusual intensity. For approximately 18 hours, the Islamic Republic maintained official silence about what had happened to its supreme leader. In the early hours of March 1, 2026, state television interrupted its broadcast. A senior official appeared on screen. His expression communicated what his words, when they finally came, confirmed. Ali Khamenei, supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, was dead. The government declared a period of national mourning. The reaction across Iran was unlike anything the country had experienced in decades. In certain districts of Tehran, particularly those associated with the conservative religious establishment and the families of IRGC soldiers, mourning gatherings formed quickly. Photographs of Khamenei appeared in windows. Religious chants echoed through neighborhoods that had been his most loyal constituencies for a generation. In other parts of the city, in reformist districts, in university neighborhoods, in the areas that had seen the most brutal crackdowns during the 2009 and 2022 uprisings, the reaction was different. Not loud, not public, given the security environment, but different. Multiple accounts described quiet celebrations, people sharing messages privately, a sense that something had shifted in the foundation of a system that had felt permanent. The duality of that response reflected 37 years of accumulated reality. Khamenei had been, to his supporters, a genuine embodiment of the revolutionary ideal, a man who had survived persecution, assassination, and war to lead the Islamic Republic through its most challenging decades. To his opponents, he had been the architect of systematic repression, of economic mismanagement, of a regional strategy that had left tens of thousands dead in proxy conflicts across the Middle East. Both of those things were true, and his death left both communities to navigate a future that neither had fully prepared for. The Assembly of Experts, Iran's clerical body technically responsible for selecting the supreme leader, convened in emergency session. Deliberations were described as tense and complicated by the factional dynamics that Khamenei had carefully managed throughout his rule. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, emerged as the figure most frequently mentioned as a potential successor, having spent years building relationships with hardline elements in both the IRGC and the clerical establishment. But succession in Iran's system is never a simple transfer of authority, and analysts who expected a clean handover were quickly reminded that the Islamic Republic had always been more fractured internally than its public face suggested. The IRGC's senior commanders were the real variable in the succession equation. Khamenei had spent decades managing the Revolutionary Guard's factional tensions, balancing hardliners against pragmatists, ensuring that no single commander accumulated enough institutional loyalty to become a rival power center. With him gone, those balancing mechanisms were gone too. The IRGC was not a unified institution in the days following the strike. It was a collection of powerful figures, each with their own networks and their own calculations about what came next. Some Western analysts had long argued that Khamenei's death would actually empower more radical elements within the IRGC, commanders who had chafed under what they considered his occasional pragmatic restraint and who saw the succession as an opportunity to move Iran toward a more openly confrontational posture. Those concerns were not hypothetical. Within days of the announcement, several IRGC factions issued statements that were markedly more aggressive in tone than anything Khamenei's official communications had produced in years. Regional consequences were immediate. Hezbollah in Lebanon faced sudden uncertainty about its command structure and its supply lines from Tehran. The Houthi leadership in Yemen received no communications through normal channels for several days. IRGC commanders in Iraq and Syria began internal repositioning, anticipating potential power shifts in Tehran that could affect their operational mandates and their funding. Missile exchanges and proxy attacks were reported across the Gulf and the Levant in the days following the strike, as various factions and state actors attempted to reshape their positions in the new reality. The international response ranged from condemnation to careful silence, depending on the relationship between individual governments and both Tehran and Washington. Legal scholars began publishing analyses of the strike's implications under international law. Strategic analysts debated whether removing Khamenei had achieved anything durable or whether it had simply elevated IRGC hardliners who had always been more militant than the supreme leader himself. Those debates will continue for years, but there is a separate story here, a story about the intelligence operation itself that deserves its own moment of clarity. If you've made it this far with me through one of the most extraordinary intelligence stories of the modern era, thank you. Genuinely. This is exactly the kind of content this channel exists to bring you, and I don't take for granted that you spent this time with me. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and you will never miss another episode. We cover real spy stories every single day. Operations, tradecraft, the human beings behind the intelligence wars that shape our world. This is what we do. Don't miss what's coming next. Before I wrap this story up, I want to hear from you. Do you think Operation Epic Fury was a justified act of targeted military action against a legitimate enemy combatant? Or did it cross a line that changes the rules of warfare in ways that could come back to haunt every government on Earth? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. Here is what the story of the hunt for Khamenei ultimately reveals, and why it matters beyond the specific events of February 28, 2026. Ali Khamenei spent the last years of his life constructing what may have been the most elaborate personal security architecture any head of state had ever built. The blindfolded generals, the sealed tunnel entrances, the 100-meter bunker complex, the layers of sons and intermediaries and loyalists who ensured that even his inner circle could not precisely locate him on any given day. He had, by any reasonable assessment, achieved something close to physical invisibility within his own capital. He was undone by data, not by a traitor at the door, not by a spy who slipped through a tunnel, not by a communications intercept that revealed a single critical conversation. He was undone by the aggregation of thousands of individually meaningless data points: traffic camera footage, elevator power consumption, ventilation shaft thermal signatures, parking sensor logs, cell tower pings, gathered over months and processed by analytical systems that could find the pattern inside the noise that no human analyst working alone could ever have identified. The CIA's pattern of life analysis didn't need to know exactly where Khamenei was every moment of every day. It needed to build a probabilistic model of his behavior accurate enough to recognize when a high-value meeting was confirmed at a specific location on a specific morning, that this particular moment was the one that all of the previous months of data had been building toward. Mossad's contribution was equally critical, the operational experience that had refined the tradecraft of targeting underground command facilities through years of practice against Hezbollah and Hamas leadership, the thermal mapping of ventilation shafts, the sleeper assets who provided human-level confirmation at the final stage, the institutional knowledge of how to bridge the gap between a confirmed intelligence picture and a successful kinetic operation. Consider the scale of what those two agencies built over the years preceding February 28th. The CIA had reportedly spent months developing what analysts described as high-fidelity intelligence on Khamenei's movements, not a general sense of his location, but a granular, regularly updated model of his behavioral patterns accurate enough to be operationally actionable. Mossad had penetrated Tehran's traffic and security camera networks to the point where convoy movements through the city could be tracked in near real time without a single officer physically present on the ground. Together, those capabilities created something that no physical fortification can defeat in the digital age: a surveillance architecture that sees not a location, but a pattern. A fortress of data built around a man who thought he was hiding in concrete. Every bunker requires ventilation. Every convoy creates a pattern. Every security rotation follows a schedule. Every human being, no matter how disciplined, eventually normalizes. And in the age of AI-assisted pattern analysis, satellite imagery, compromised urban infrastructure, and multi-domain intelligence fusion, normalization is fatal. Khamenei had understood this at some level: the blindfolded generals, the sealed tunnels, the extreme compartmentalization, all reflected an awareness that information was the real threat. But understanding the principle and defeating the execution are two entirely different things. His security architecture was designed to protect against the intelligence methods of the previous generation. The methods that found him were from the next one. There is an irony here that is almost too precise to be accidental. The digital surveillance infrastructure that Khamenei had spent years deploying against his own population, the facial recognition systems, the social media monitoring, the Chinese AI surveillance tools used to track protest leaders, operated on exactly the same principle as the intelligence systems that ultimately found him: pattern recognition, behavioral mapping, the identification of individuals not through direct observation, but through the data they generate simply by living. He built a surveillance state, and in the end, the surveillance state's most powerful version was the one pointed at him. The operation that ended his life was not, in the final analysis, primarily a military achievement. The munitions were important. The air defense suppression was important. The daytime strike doctrine override was important. But all of those elements were downstream of the intelligence. Months of painstaking, methodical, AI-assisted data collection and analysis that transformed a man who had spent decades making himself invisible into a targetable signature. The man who disappeared underground had spent 37 years building walls that no one could see. In the end, the walls were there. They were real. They were deep. And they were not enough, because the intelligence that found him didn't need to breach them. It simply waited until he moved through them at a moment that had been confirmed, coordinated, and targeted with a precision that the Islamic Republic's defenders had never imagined possible. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, the architect of the axis of resistance, the man who had survived Savak torture chambers and assassination attempts, and international sanctions, and the fury of his own people rising against him again and again, was undone not by a betrayal at the door, and not by a failure of nerve among the men around him. He was undone by patterns. And in the intelligence wars of the 21st century, patterns are everything.